The paper sat on my desk for 11 seconds before I picked it up. I know because I was counting. It was a habit I developed after years of working inside systems that moved faster than human instinct, and counting gave me something to hold on to when everything else felt like it was falling apart. The paper was not really paper. It was a thin crystalline sheet, warm to the touch, carrying the official seal of the Galactic Accord Council. 7 interlocking rings. The symbol of unity between species that had been crossing the stars for thousands of years, before we even split the atom. My name is Owen Garrett. At the time, I was 34 years old, and I worked for something called the Council Observation Bureau, which was a fancy way of saying I watched powerful aliens make decisions about humanity and wrote detailed reports that most people back home never read. I had spent 6 years doing this job. I had watched species negotiate trade routes, debate territorial rights, argue over atmospheric classifications of newly discovered worlds. I had seen things that would make most people sit down on the floor and stare at the ceiling for a long time. But when I picked up that crystalline sheet, I felt something I had not felt since my first week on the station. I felt afraid. The document was called the Unified Behavioral Mandate. It was 47 pages long. The summary alone took 20 minutes to read, and by the time I finished the second paragraph, my hands were no longer steady. The mandate required every species operating under the Accord to submit to population monitoring, behavioral assessment programs, emotional regulation implants, and a hard limit on territorial expansion beyond 3 approved star systems. In exchange, humanity would receive access to faster trade lanes, council-tier medical technology, and protection from the Vect swarm, which was currently eating its way through the outer rim and had already destroyed 4 inhabited worlds. I put the sheet down. I picked it up again. I read the part about the implants 3 more times because I wanted to make sure I was understanding it correctly. I was. Ambassador Vale of the Sarathi arrived at Earth's Geneva Hall 2 days later. I was in the observation gallery above the main floor, standing beside Dr. Nina Hartley, who was the Council Bureau's lead cultural analyst and the sharpest person I had ever worked with. Nina had a gift for reading alien body language that I had never fully understood. She could watch a Sarathi diplomat adjust the position of one arm and tell you what mood they were in, what they wanted, and what they were afraid of. She watched Vale move across the floor toward the assembled Earth Coalition representatives, and she said quietly, without turning to look at me, "He thinks this is a kindness." "I know," I said. "That's going to be the problem," she said. Vale was tall, even by Sarathi standards. His species averaged about 2.5 meters, with 4 arms arranged in pairs and a face that had evolved for calm rather than expression. They communicated complex emotion through movement, not facial muscle. Watching Vale walk was like watching water move through a narrow channel. Everything was smooth. Everything was controlled. His people had not known war in over 3,000 years, and it showed in every line of his body. He believed, genuinely and completely, that the mandate was a gift. The Sarathi had built the Accord 2,000 years ago after a catastrophic period of interstellar conflict. They had watched a dozen species tear themselves apart and concluded that governance was the answer. Not suggestion, not cooperation, governance. They had developed behavioral management tools, implemented them across member species over generations, and watched those species stabilize, grow, and stop hurting each other. From where Vale stood, the evidence was overwhelming and the logic was clean. Managed species survived. Unmanaged species burned. He had looked at our history. He had seen us burn. What he had not asked was what we built from the ash. The hearing lasted 3 days. I watched most of it from the gallery, and I took notes in the margins of my reports the way I always did when something felt important, and I did not yet have words for why. Earth's coalition representatives were careful. They asked procedural questions. They requested clarification on the monitoring protocols. They noted politely but clearly that the expansion cap would affect existing settlements already operating beyond the proposed boundary. Vale answered every question with the same patient, fluid calm. He acknowledged the concerns. He offered modified implementation timelines. He emphasized the trade access and the medical technology and the shields against the Vect, and every time he came back to the shields, the room got a little quieter because the Vect were real and the outer rim was close, and 4 worlds were already gone. On the third day, I got a message from Nina. It was short. It said, "They are going to sign." I already knew. I had known since the second day, when the coalition representative from the Northern Atlantic Bloc asked about the implant removal protocols rather than the implants themselves. That was the moment the question changed from whether to how. I stood at the window of my quarters that night and looked out at the station lights, reflecting off the hull of a Davari cargo freighter docked 3 platforms over. The Davari were one of the oldest Accord member species. They had been wearing their behavioral dampeners for so long that their young were born with a physiological dependency on the calibration signals. They were peaceful and organized and deeply, genuinely content, and I had never once in 6 years of working alongside them seen one of them get angry. Not frustrated, not irritated, completely, permanently, unreachably calm. I thought about my father, who had once punched a hole in a kitchen wall because the hospital told him they had no more options for my mother's treatment, and then spent the next 6 months learning everything there was to know about experimental oncology and found a clinical trial in Germany that saved her life. I thought about what my father would look like with a dampener behind his ear. I thought about what he would not have done. The coalition signed the Provisional Compliance Agreement 4 months later, not unanimously. The vote was close enough that the exact numbers were not released to the public right away. But it passed, and the mandate moved from proposal to policy, and the Accord sent its formal acknowledgement, and Ambassador Vail issued a statement calling it a historic moment of unity. I stood in the observation gallery the day the vote result came through, and I watched the screens, and I did not feel historic. I felt the way you feel when a storm is coming, and you can see it on the horizon, but you cannot yet feel the wind. Something was moving. Something large and slow and inevitable was already in motion, and nobody in that room, not even the ones who had voted against signing, fully understood what they had just put into contact with each other. The mandate and us. I filed my report that evening. I titled it simply, "Compliance Agreement Signed." I wrote 11 pages of careful, professional observation, and at the very end, in the section marked Analyst Notes, I wrote one sentence that I thought about for a long time before I left it in. I wrote, "They do not know what they are managing." I hit send. I closed my screen. I went to the station cafeteria and ate something that was supposedly a sandwich and stared at the table for a while. An Accord maintenance worker, a young pale kin with silver skin and eyes like still water, sat down across from me without asking. Her species did not have a word for privacy the way we did. She looked at me with the mild curiosity her kind always carried and said, in her careful, accented English, "You look like you are thinking about something that has not happened yet." "Maybe," I said. "Is it bad?" she asked. I looked at her. I thought about the mandate. I thought about 400 outposts that had not been counted yet. I thought about my father and the hole in the kitchen wall and the clinical trial in Germany. "I genuinely don't know," I said. "Ask me in a year." She nodded and finished her meal and left, and I sat there alone in the quiet of the station cafeteria, and outside the windows, the stars did not care about any of it one way or the other, which I found, somehow, very comforting. The leash was on. But we had never in our entire history stayed leashed for long, not because we were reckless, not because we were wild, but because we were the species that looked at a closed door and immediately started thinking about what was on the other side. We could not help it. It was not a flaw. It was the thing that had kept us alive through every catastrophe we had ever faced, and there had been many, and we had faced all of them, and we were still here. I paid for my sandwich and walked back to my quarters. The countdown had started, and nobody knew it yet except me, and I was not entirely sure I knew what I was counting down to. But I knew it was coming. Nina found me in the data corridor on a Tuesday morning, 11 weeks after the mandate went into effect. She was walking fast, which was unusual for her. Nina Hartley did not walk fast as a rule. She moved through the station with the measured pace of someone who had decided long ago that urgency was a form of information leakage, and she preferred to keep her information private. When she was walking fast, it meant something had happened that she had not predicted. She put a data chip in my hand without slowing down and kept walking. I followed her. We ended up in one of the small meeting rooms off the secondary observation ring, the kind nobody booked because the environmental controls were unreliable and it smelled faintly of Davari maintenance fluid. She closed the door. She turned to face me. "Kepler Settlement 7, she said. I had already pulled the chip data onto my handheld screen. Kepler Settlement 7 was a mining and materials processing outpost about 14 months outside the approved three-system boundary. It had been flagged in the first compliance audit, which meant it was supposed to have initiated shutdown proceedings within 30 days of the mandate taking effect. 30 days had passed. Then another 30. The flag was still open. "They haven't shut down," I said. "No," Nina said, "and look at their output logs." I looked. Production had increased by 12% since the mandate went into effect. I sat down on the edge of the table because it felt like the right thing to do at that moment. Did anyone send them the shutdown order? 3 times, Nina said. First by standard council relay, second by Accord mediator courier, third by direct transmission from the Bureau. And they responded to all 3, politely, in writing, acknowledged receipt, thanked the relevant parties for their communication. "And kept working," I said. "And kept working." I stared at the output logs for a moment. What's their council makeup? Nina leaned over and pulled up the settlement record. 12 people, elected rotating leadership. Primary industries are ceramosteel refining and deep-core mineral extraction. They have been operating for 9 years. Current population is 340, including 87 children born on site. "So they have kids," I said. "They have kids," Nina confirmed. I understood immediately, and I think Nina knew I understood, because she did not explain it further. A settlement with 87 children born on that rock, children who had never known any other home, was not going to shut down because a council of alien diplomats on the other side of the galaxy sent them a form letter. Not out of stubbornness, not out of defiance, but because the practical problem in front of them was 340 people who needed food and air and warmth, and the mandate did not solve that problem. Shutting down only made it worse. The mediators went out 3 weeks later. 2 ships, full formal authority, the kind of delegation the Accord sent when it wanted to make clear that it was serious. I read the mission report when it came back. The lead mediator, a Sarathi named Shen Vorak, described arriving at the settlement to find the docking bay clean, the population calm, and a meal waiting. They had been expected. The settlement council met with Vorak and his team for 4 hours. The conversation, according to Vorak's report, was entirely civil. The settlement explained that they understood the mandate. They explained that they had reviewed their options. They explained that there was no practical path to relocation within the timeline provided. They asked whether the mediators could assist with either a relocation plan or a temporary exemption while one was developed. Vorak said he did not have authority to offer either. The settlement council thanked him, offered his team accommodations for the night, and in the morning the mediators flew back to the relay station. The settlement kept working. I was in the Bureau's main analysis room when the second flag came up, 2 days after Vorak's ships returned. Then the third. Then, within a week, 11 more. I watched the board fill up and I felt a kind of quiet, electric recognition in my chest. Not surprise. Something closer to the feeling you get when you see a proof finally complete itself on paper. The settlements were not coordinating. That was the thing Nina kept coming back to in our conversations during those weeks, and she was right, and it was the thing that the council was going to be slowest to understand. There was no network, no organized resistance. No committee had met and voted to defy the mandate. Each settlement was simply looking at the problem directly in front of it and responding to that problem with whatever tools it had. And what they had was ingenuity. The calm protocol appeared in the third week. Nobody could trace its origin cleanly, which was itself a kind of answer. It ran on a set of dead frequencies that the Accord monitoring system did not cover because dead frequencies were, by definition, not worth covering. Someone somewhere had noticed the gap and built something in it. Within 2 weeks, the protocol had spread to 60 outposts, not because anyone ordered them to use it, because it was shared through the normal informal networks that any isolated community develops when it needs to solve problems faster than official channels allow. The method spread the same way a good recipe spreads. Someone tried it, it worked, they told someone else. Ambassador Vale called me into his office on a Thursday afternoon. His office was large by station standards, climate-controlled to Sarathi preference, which meant it was slightly cooler than I liked, and the air had a faint mineral quality. He was standing at the viewport when I arrived, looking out at the shipping lanes. He did not turn around immediately. When he did, his expression was the Sarathi equivalent of a headache. I had learned to recognize it over years of observation. A slight tension in the shoulder joints, a particular angle to the secondary arms. "Your people are not cooperating," he said. "My people," I said carefully, "are solving the problems directly in front of them." "The problem directly in front of them," he said, "is a lawful order from the Accord Council." "No," I said. "The problem directly in front of them is 300 families who need to eat. The lawful order is the thing making that harder." He looked at me for a long moment. I held his gaze. We had always been honest with each other, Vale and I, more honest than diplomacy usually allowed, and I thought that honesty was worth preserving even in a conversation like this one. "How many settlements?" he asked. "Currently flagged, 43, I said. "Probable total, including unflagged ones. Somewhere between 100 and 200. We do not have good visibility on the outer layers." His secondary arms moved. I did not know that particular movement well enough to read it precisely, but it looked something like disbelief. "The monitoring system should be tracking." "The monitoring system tracks what it was built to track," I said. "We built some of those settlements before the monitoring protocols existed. Others are operating in areas where the relay coverage is thin. Others are using communication methods your system was not designed to detect. Because they were built to evade us." "Because they were built to work," I said. "The evasion is a side effect. These are people who grew up in communities where the nearest help was months away. You build redundancy into everything when that is your reality. You build backup systems. You build alternative routes. You do it because you have to, not because you are planning to use it against anyone." Vale was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I had not expected from him. "I want to understand this," he said. "Not politically, not strategically. I want to understand why your species is like this." I looked at him. The sincerity in his voice was real. That was the thing about Vale that made him genuinely different from most of the council members I dealt with. He actually wanted to understand. He had simply been working with the wrong model. "Can I tell you about my grandmother?" I asked. He gestured with one hand, an invitation. "She was born in a country that stopped existing before she turned 30, I said. "The government fell. The economy collapsed. The infrastructure her whole life had been built around simply ceased to function. She was 32 years old with 2 small children and no support system. So she learned to grow food in a space the size of this desk. She learned to repair electrical equipment with parts that were not designed to fit together. She made trades with her neighbors. She built a network of people who helped each other. She kept her children alive and eventually built something stable from nothing." I paused. "She was not unusual," I said. "Every family on Earth has a version of that story. Some of them are recent. Some of them are generations back, but they are all there. They are in our memory. They are in the way we think about problems. When your monitoring system went up and the mandate went into effect, every settlement out there did not see a law. They saw a new version of the same problem their great-grandparents solved. and they started solving it. Vale was very still. In Sarathi body language, stillness was attention at its most complete. "We did not model for that," he said finally. "No," I said. "You modeled for organized resistance. That is what every other species does when they disagree with governance. They form opposition parties. They hold votes. They send representatives. You have protocols for all of that. And you are not doing any of those things," he said. "We are doing all of those things as well," I said, "but in parallel, independently, simultaneously. The resistance you can see is the formal, organized kind. The thing you are not seeing is every individual settlement just solving its own problem in its own way, and the total of all those individual solutions adding up to something that looks, from the outside, like a coordinated campaign." "But it is not," he said. "It is not," I agreed. He turned back to the viewport. The shipping lanes moved outside, quiet and steady and indifferent. "What do you recommend?" he asked. "I recommend," I said, "that you let me go back to my desk and write a report. And I recommend that when you read it, you pay particular attention to the section on compounding effects, because what is happening right now is still very small, and in my professional assessment, it is going to get significantly larger before it gets smaller." He did not respond. I left his office and walked back to the bureau and sat down at my desk and opened a new report file. I stared at the blank page for a long time. Then I started writing, and I did not stop for 4 hours, and when I finished, I had 32 pages of the most important analysis I had ever produced, and I knew that by the time anyone senior enough acted on it, the window it described would already be closed. I sent it anyway. That evening, the flagged settlement count crossed 60. By morning, it was 84. I made a pot of tea, sat at my desk, and watched the number climb, and I felt, running underneath everything else, a slow and unmistakable pride that I kept carefully out of my official reports. We were not defying the council. We were just being ourselves. And ourselves, it turned out, was more than enough. The blockade went up on a Wednesday. I know because I had a meeting scheduled that morning with a pale kin data analyst named Oren, who had been helping me cross-reference settlement activity logs, and the meeting was canceled 20 minutes before it was supposed to start. The reason given was station security protocols. That was the first sign. When Oren messaged me privately an hour later and said simply, "Look at the shipping lanes," I went to the nearest viewport and looked. The council frigates were already in position around the solar system, not near the station, around Earth. Davari enforcement cruisers flanked them in the configuration their military doctrine called the Patience Ring, which was named that because it was designed not for immediate action but for long, slow pressure. A ring that squeezed gradually and waited for the thing inside to give. I stood at that viewport for a long time. My first thought was practical. I needed to file a report. My second thought was personal, and it hit harder than I expected. My parents were on Earth. My sister Alina and her 2 kids were in Edinburgh. Everyone I had grown up with was inside that ring, and an alien fleet had just drawn a line around them. I went back to my desk. I filed the report. I kept my language clinical and precise because that was the job, and because letting emotion into official analysis made the analysis less useful, not more. But my hands were not entirely steady when I typed. The blockade cut off Earth's access to the Accord's primary trade networks. That meant no council-tier medical technology, no priority shipping lanes, no protected passage through the outer systems. Everything that the mandate had offered as incentive was now withdrawn as punishment. The council's logic was clear. If humanity would not comply willingly, it would comply through necessity. I had been in this job long enough to know that this logic worked on every other species in the Accord. The pale kin had bent to exactly this kind of pressure 400 years ago and had been compliant members of the Accord ever since. The Davari had needed only the threat of it. The smaller species, the ones that had joined the Accord in the last century, had seen the history and concluded that the fight was not worth having. But none of those species had the particular relationship with being cut off that humanity had. I called Nina on a private channel. She answered from what looked like a storage room, which told me she had been expecting the call and had already found somewhere to speak freely. "How long do you think it holds?" I asked. She did not ask what I meant. The blockade, as a pressure tool, 4 months at the outside, probably less. "Why less?" "They did not model the supply chain correctly," she said. "I have been looking at Accord trade dependency data for 3 years. There are 11 categories of goods and materials where human production accounts for more than 30% of total Accord supply. 3 of those categories are above 60%. The Council's economic planners know this. They calculated that the disruption to Accord markets would be manageable. What they did not calculate is the distribution of that disruption. Meaning the goods we produce do not go evenly to all species. The Davari shipyards take 68% of our ceramasteel output. The Sarathi Medical Consortium depends on human pharmaceutical research for a specific class of treatments that no other species has fully developed. The Pale Kin's information routing infrastructure runs through relay nodes that were built and are maintained by human engineering teams. I understood, so when they cut us off, they also cut specific other species off from things they specifically need, she said. The blockade is not going to hurt all Accord members equally. It is going to hurt some of them very badly and very specifically, and those species are not going to quietly accept that for very long. Have you filed this? I filed it 6 weeks ago, she said. Before the blockade went up, nobody acted on it. Send it to me again. I want to add supporting data and resubmit under joint authorship. She sent it within the minute. I spent the next 8 hours expanding the analysis, adding 3 years of supply chain records, running the projections forward, and writing what I considered to be the clearest and most direct warning I had produced in 6 years of working for the Bureau. I titled it Cascade Risk Assessment, Blockade Scenario. I submitted it to every senior council liaison I had a direct channel to. Then I waited. I did not wait long. The first formal complaint came from the Davari Logistics Ministry 13 days into the blockade. It was carefully worded, diplomatic in tone, framed as a technical concern rather than a political objection. But it was a complaint, and the Davari did not complain. Their behavioral management made sustained unhappiness nearly impossible for them. For them to formally flag a concern meant the disruption was significant enough to cut through the dampeners. The Sarathi Medical Consortium followed 9 days later. Their communication was less diplomatic. They had a category of treatments in shortage. The shortage was worsening, and the alternative suppliers they had approached could not meet the required specifications. The research that produced those treatments was human-led, human-staffed, and had been ongoing for decades. You could not replace it in weeks. You could not replace it in months, maybe not in years. The Pale Kin situation was the most interesting. And I say interesting because I have to say something, and what I actually felt was closer to a very particular kind of dark satisfaction that I kept entirely to myself. Their information routing infrastructure had, without anyone fully realizing it, developed a functional dependency on human relay nodes that had been installed, updated, and maintained by human engineering teams working under standard Accord contracts. When the blockade went up, those contracts were frozen. The team stopped working. The nodes started degrading. The Pale Kin information networks did not fail. They are too old and too well built to fail quickly, but they started getting slower. Latency climbed. Data integrity dropped fractions of a percent that, at the volume they were handling, translated to real and measurable problems. The Pale Kin noticed within days. They said nothing publicly for 2 weeks. When they finally spoke, they spoke loudly. I remember the session where their senior representative, a woman called Ayan, raised her voice. The Pale Kin raised their voices about once per generation, historically speaking. The chamber went very quiet when it happened. Ayan did not shout. She simply spoke at a volume and a pace that made absolutely clear that what she was saying was not a diplomatic courtesy but a statement of fact. She said that the blockade was causing measurable harm to Pale Kin infrastructure, and that this harm would compound over time, and that the council had not adequately assessed this outcome before implementing the strategy, and that she expected a formal response within 72 hours. Ambassador Vale said, in the careful way he always said things, that the situation was being monitored and that he remained confident the pressure would produce the desired result. Ian looked at him for a moment. Then she said, quietly, Ambassador, I have reviewed the historical record on human response to economic isolation. I would like to suggest that the desired result may not be the one you receive. The session ended 40 minutes later. I had been sitting in the observer section, taking notes, and when the chamber cleared I stayed in my seat for a while and thought about what I had just watched. The accord was not fracturing, not yet, but it was straining. You could hear it the way you hear ice strain before it cracks, a low, sustained sound that most people dismiss as background noise until suddenly it is not background anymore. Back on Earth, the response to the blockade was not panic. That surprised some people in the council, I think. They had expected panic. They had expected pressure from the population on the coalition to comply, to accept the mandate, to end the blockade and restore the trade access. Some of that pressure existed. It was real and it was loud, and it was covered extensively in the news feeds that found their way to the station through the remaining open channels. But running underneath, it was something else. I could see it in the data. Agricultural output in regions that had previously relied on accord supply supplements had increased by 9%. Manufacturing sectors had shifted production priority without any central directive. Pharmaceutical research institutions had opened cooperative channels with each other that had previously been closed by competitive interests. The blockade, intended to make humanity desperate and compliant, had instead activated something deep and reflexive in our collective response to threat. We had done this before. Different threat, different century, same pattern. You take away what we depend on, and we immediately start figuring out how to not depend on it anymore. Not because we are stubborn, because we have been through enough that this kind of adaptation lives in our muscle memory as a species. I called my sister Alina on a priority family channel, one of the few still open. She answered looking tired but not frightened. Behind her, her kids were doing something noisy. She had started a neighborhood food cooperative 3 weeks ago with 8 other families on her street. They were growing things in every spare corner of every spare space. She showed me the containers on her windowsill with the pride of someone who had solved a genuinely interesting problem. "Are you scared?" I asked her. "I am busy," she said. "Different thing." After the call, I sat at my desk and wrote in my personal notes, not my official report, just for myself. The council blockaded us to show us what we would lose. What they actually showed us was what we did not need. The Davari formal complaint became a formal objection. The Sarathi Medical Consortium escalated to their governing council. The Pale Kin called for an emergency session. 3 smaller accord species, watching the larger ones struggle, quietly began reconsidering their own relationships with the accord, and whether the governance structure they had accepted was actually serving them as well as they had assumed. The blockade was 11 weeks old when the first internal accord trade dispute broke out between the Davari and the Sarathi over redistribution of supply chain access. They had been the accord's 2 most stable and cooperative members for over 1,000 years. They did not argue. Their behavioral management made sustained conflict nearly impossible. And yet there they were, filing formal objections against each other in the Council's dispute resolution framework, because the pressure of the blockade had redistributed scarcities in ways nobody had planned for. And scarcity, even mild scarcity, is a stress test that almost nothing passes without showing a crack somewhere. Nina sent me a message that day. It contained only 4 words. It said, "The cascade has started." I read it. I looked out the viewport at the Davari freighter that was still sitting at the dock 3 platforms over, now 3 months into a docking that was supposed to have lasted 2 weeks. It could not leave because its cargo was Earth-sourced materials bound for a Sarathi manufacturing facility, and the facility had frozen the order, and the Davari shipping company was holding the freighter while it waited for someone to tell it what to do. A large, sophisticated piece of machinery, sitting still because a document with 7 interlocking rings on it had created a problem nobody had fully thought through. I thought about my father again. I thought about the hole in the wall and the clinical trial and the 6 months of sleepless nights that connected those two things. I thought about 312 outposts still working, 400 maybe more. I thought about Eliner's windowsill garden. I opened a new report file and started typing. Outside the viewport, the blockade held, and inside it we adapted. And around it, the Accord began to understand, very slowly and very painfully, that it had built itself around a foundation it had never thought to examine. The cascade had started. And nobody, not the council, not the mediators, not Ambassador Vale, had a model for what came next. The emergency session was called on the 43rd day of what the council's internal communications were now referring to as the correction impasse. I had a copy of that communication before most of the delegations did, because I had spent 6 years learning which administrative staff on which shifts were willing to share advanced scheduling notices in exchange for bureau-sourced analysis reports. Information moved in both directions when you worked in observation long enough to know where the doors were. The chamber was full when I arrived. I had been granted observer status rather than analyst status for this session, which meant I sat in the upper ring rather than the floor level, but it also meant I had a better view of the whole room and nobody expected me to take formal notes. I could just watch. 700 seats in concentric arcs around a central dais. Every delegation present. The environmental systems were working harder than usual, managing the atmospheric preferences of 15 species at once, and the air in my section smelled like something between a mountain morning and a chemistry classroom. I had stopped noticing it years ago, but today it seemed very sharp. Owen Garrett, 34 years old, sitting in the upper ring of the Galactic Accord Council chamber, while an alien governing body tried to figure out what to do about the species he belonged to. My recorder was running, my hands were still. Elder Vec of the Davari opened the session. The Davari were given the floor first because they had filed the formal objection that had technically triggered the emergency call, and also because Elder Vec was 3 meters tall and had a voice that carried without amplification in a way that most other species found instinctively compelling. He was old, older than any living human by a factor of 3. And he moved with the careful deliberateness of something that had no reason to hurry. He said, in the measured cadence of someone who had weighed every word before arriving in the room, "We appear to have made an error in our assessment of human replaceability." The silence that followed was the specific kind of silence that happens when everyone in a room hears something true that nobody wanted to say out loud first. I let it sit for a moment. Then I reached into my bag for a protein bar, because I had not eaten since early morning, and this was going to be a long session, and I did not want to make any important observations while my blood sugar was low. Elder Vec continued. He presented the Davari supply chain data in full. He was not a person who dramatized things, which made the presentation more effective, not less. He listed the numbers with the same tone a physician uses when describing a diagnosis. Ceramasteel supply down to 31% of operational requirements. 3 major shipyard programs delayed, 2 already suspended. Estimated recovery timeline without human supply restoration, 4 to 7 years, assuming aggressive alternative sourcing, which had so far not produced competitive specifications. He sat down. The Sarathi Medical Consortium's representative, a younger Sarathi named Teve, presented next. Teve was not senior enough to be a council member, which meant something had happened to whoever was supposed to be there. I made a note. Teve was careful and precise and visibly stressed in the Sarathi way, which meant the shoulder tension was significant and the secondary arms were very still in a way that was different from calm. She described the treatment shortage. She described the gap between what the Accord's alternative suppliers could provide and what was needed. She described the projected impact on patient outcomes if the shortage continued for more than another 6 months, and she used numbers, not vague language, and the numbers were not comfortable to hear. She sat down. Ian of the Pale Kin did not present a report. She stood, looked at the room, and said, "Our infrastructure is functioning at 89.4% of standard. Every week this continues, that number decreases. We project crossing the critical threshold in approximately 14 weeks. Below that threshold, the information routing systems that service 40% of Accord administrative functions become unreliable. We wanted this in the record." She sat down. 3 smaller delegations made brief statements of concern. 2 more requested review of their own compliance requirements, framing the requests as procedural rather than political, which was the diplomatic way of saying they were beginning to ask whether the whole structure made sense. Then it was quiet, and Ambassador Vale stood. I had known Vale for 4 years. I had watched him navigate situations that would have ended most diplomatic careers. He was good at his job in the way that a very well-designed instrument is good at its function: precise, reliable, built for a specific purpose, and excellent at fulfilling it. His purpose, his whole professional life, was stability, order, the preservation of the Accord's capacity to govern. He stood at the dais, and he looked, for the first time in 4 years, like someone who was standing in a place he had not expected to be. He said, "The mandate remains the appropriate framework for long-term stability. The current disruptions are significant but manageable. The correct response is to maintain the pressure and allow the necessary adjustment period to complete." He said it well. He said it with conviction. And I watched the room, and I saw something that I suspected Vale could not see from where he was standing, because he was at the center of the room, and I was at the edge of it with a full view of every delegation. Nobody believed him. Not the Davari, whose economic pain was past the point where belief was relevant. Not Ian, who had given precise numbers and whose expression during Vale's statement was the Pale Kin equivalent of quietly disagreeing with everything being said. Not the smaller delegations, who had come into this session uncertain and were leaving it with conclusions already forming. I waited until the first break in proceedings to send a message to Nina. I wrote, "He has lost the room." She replied within 2 minutes, "I know. I am watching the feed. What happens next is yours." Meaning, I was the only human in the chamber. What happened next was going to require someone who could speak for us without speaking officially, and I was it. The break lasted 20 minutes. I used most of it to eat my protein bar and think very carefully about what I was going to say, and more importantly, how I was going to say it. Not the content. I knew the content, the framing, the order, which facts to lead with and which to hold back, how to be honest without being confrontational, how to give Vale an exit from his position that did not require him to admit he had been completely wrong, because people who feel trapped fight harder than people who feel they have a choice. When the session resumed, I requested the floor. The chamber director looked at me with the mild surprise that most non-human species still produced when a human did something assertive in a formal setting. Then she granted the request. I walked down from the upper ring. I walked across the floor to the central speaking position. 700 seats looking at me. 15 species. The most powerful governing body in the explored galaxy, or so they had believed until relatively recently. I put my hands flat on the speaking surface, not because I needed the support, but because it was a human gesture of directness, and I had learned that alien species found human body language interesting enough to pay close attention to it. "I want to start with a number," I said. 312. That is the confirmed count of human settlements currently operating outside the approved boundary. The probable actual count, based on the monitoring gap analysis my colleague Nina Hartley and I submitted 14 weeks ago, is closer to 400. These settlements have not shut down. They have not slowed down. Some of them have accelerated production, not to defy this council. Because they have 300 families who need to eat, and no viable alternative. I paused. The room was very quiet. "I want to give you a second number. 11. That is how many categories of Accord critical goods and materials where human production currently exceeds 30% of total supply. You already heard from Elder Vec and Representative Teeve and Delegate Ian about what happens to specific sectors when that supply is interrupted. What I want to add is this. Those numbers are not coincidental. They are the result of 40 years of human presence in accord trade networks during which your economic planners consistently underpriced human contributions because your actuarial models assessed us as high-risk partners. The discount you offered us reflected your uncertainty about our stability. The dependency you built anyway reflected the actual quality of what we produced. I saw Vale's secondary arm shift. I kept going. The mandate was designed to manage a risk. The risk was real. Human history is complicated and sometimes dark, and we do not ask you to pretend otherwise. But the tool you built to manage that risk did not account for what makes us the risk you assessed us as in the first place. The same qualities that made your analysts nervous about us are the qualities that built the supply chains you now depend on. You cannot separate them. You cannot have the ceramasteel without the people who spent 9 years building a settlement in a place most species would not go, under conditions most species would not accept, because there was work to be done and they needed to do it. I looked at Vale directly. You came to us with a proposal you called a gift. I believe you meant it that way. I believe the mandate was, from your perspective, an act of care toward a species your models told you was at risk of harming itself and others. I want to acknowledge that because it matters, and because what I am about to say is not an accusation. He was watching me with complete attention, all 4 arms perfectly still. You built a model of us based on what you saw us do. You did not build a model of us based on why we did it. You saw the difficult periods in our history and concluded we needed management. You did not ask what produced those periods, and you did not ask what ended them. The answer to both questions is the same. It is us. We produced them and we ended them. And the thing that ended them is the same thing that built 312 outposts outside your boundary line, and the same thing that grew food on windowsills in Edinburgh during a blockade, and the same thing that built comm protocols on dead frequencies when the standard channels were closed. I took a breath. We do not need managing. We need partnering. Those are different relationships, and only one of them produces the outcomes you actually want. The room was very quiet. Elder Vec broke it. He said, without standing, simply from his seat, "What do you propose?" "The mandate is gone," I said. "That is not a proposal. It is a description of what has already happened. You can formalize its removal or not, but it is not functioning and it will not function, and maintaining it as a policy while it fails in practice creates ambiguity that is worse for everyone than clarity. What I propose is that we replace it with something built on an accurate understanding of what humanity is and what humanity provides, and we do that negotiation with both sides honest about what they need and what they can offer." "And the expansion cap?" Ian asked. "Also gone," I said. "For the same reason. There are 400 settlements outside the line. Some of them are 9 years old. The line exists on paper. Enforcing it would require relocating thousands of people from homes they built with their own hands, and I do not think this council has the capacity to do that, and I think you know that." The silence this time was different. It was the silence of a room deciding something. Vale said quietly, "You are not offering us much room." "I am offering you accurate information," I said. "What you do with it is up to you. But I would rather give you an honest picture of where we are than a comfortable one that leads to another 6 months of this." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "We would like to renegotiate." And I said, "I know." What followed was 11 days that I would later describe in my official report as intensive diplomatic restructuring, and describe in my personal notes as the most exhausting and strangely exhilarating thing I had ever done. I ate protein bars and drank too much coffee, and slept in 4-hour intervals on a cot in one of the bureau's back rooms, and spent 12 to 14 hours a day in various combinations of formal sessions, informal conversations, side meetings with individual delegations, and long, quiet hours with Nina going over numbers and language and strategy. The behavioral suppression program was formally dissolved on day 4. It did not take long to negotiate that point, because by then everyone in the room understood that it had never been operational in any meaningful sense, and pretending otherwise was not useful. The expansion cap took until day 8. There was real disagreement there, not about whether it could be enforced, everyone had accepted it could not, but about what the alternative framework looked like. I spent most of day 7 with Elder Vec's economic advisory team working through a resource-sharing model that gave the Accord predictable access to output from human settlements in exchange for protected passage and infrastructure support. It was not perfect. No model that 2 species develop in 48 hours under pressure is going to be perfect. But it was honest, which was better than the mandate had ever been. On day 9, 3 smaller Accord species filed formal requests to review their own compliance agreements. On day 10, the Davari and Sarathi withdrew their mutual dispute filings. On day 11, Ian sent me a brief private message that read, "Your infrastructure teams can resume work immediately. We appreciate the efficiency." I smiled at that for a long time. The final document was called the Thessaly Agreement, named for the building on Earth's southern coast where the human coalition had gathered to review and ratify the terms. 7 interlocking rings still appeared on the cover page, but below them was a new line that had never appeared on any Accord document before. It read, "Mutual dependency acknowledged." I slept for 14 hours when it was over. 6 months after the Thessaly Agreement was signed, I am sitting in a garden in Kyoto that my grandfather planted, and his grandfather planted before him. The cherry trees are doing what cherry trees always do this time of year, being brief and beautiful and completely unaware that they are either. The petals fall when they fall, without ceremony and without delay, and land on the stone paths in small drifts that the morning wind moves around without purpose. I have been back on Earth for 3 weeks. I'm supposed to be on leave. Nina keeps sending me analysis reports anyway, and I keep reading them because that is the kind of people we both are. The reports are good. The Thessaly framework is holding. The first formal review session is scheduled for 90 days from now, and all parties have confirmed attendance, which is more than anyone expected when the 11-day negotiation ended. I have been thinking about what Ambassador Vale said to me the morning I left the station. He came to the docking bay himself, which was unusual. He stood in the doorway for a while, watching the crew finish the loading procedures, and then he walked over to where I was standing and he said, without preamble, "I have been reading more of your history." "All of it?" I asked. "Enough," he said. "I read about the periods your historians call the recovery eras, the generations after the large catastrophes, the periods where your species rebuilt. And I noticed something I had not noticed before," he said. "In your history, the recovery eras are often described as your greatest periods, not your most peaceful periods, your greatest, the periods that produced the most significant advances, the most creative work, the most lasting institutions." I nodded. He was right. It was not a comfortable truth about us, but it was true. "We saw the catastrophes," he said slowly. "We did not see what the catastrophes produced." "No," I said, "you stopped reading too early." He was quiet for a moment. The docking bay was loud around us, machinery moving, crew calling out to each other, the normal organized chaos of departure. "We built the Accord on the principle that stability was the highest goal," he said. "That if you eliminated the conditions that produced catastrophe, you eliminated catastrophe." "And what do you think now?" I asked. "I think," he said carefully, "that you cannot eliminate the conditions that produced catastrophe without also eliminating the conditions that produced recovery, and that possibly for your species, those are the same conditions." I shook his 4 hands. He held on for a moment before letting go, which in Sarathi custom was a sign of something between respect and genuine feeling, and I was moved by it more than I expected to be. "Come visit sometime," I said. "I will show you the garden." "I would like that," he said, and I believed him. Now I am in the garden, and the cherry trees are doing their brief and beautiful work, and I am thinking about everything that happened and trying to understand what it means. Not politically, not strategically, just as a person sitting in a garden that has existed for longer than the Accord knew we were here. We did not defeat the council. I want to be clear about that, because the story could be told that way, and I think telling it that way would miss the point entirely. We did not defeat anyone. The blockade failed not because we pushed back against it, but because we simply continued being ourselves, and being ourselves was incompatible with the system they were trying to impose, and the system broke before we did. I think about Alina's windowsill garden. She sent me a picture last week. It is thriving. She has expanded it to include the building's shared roof space, and 3 other families are involved now, and she is planning to keep it running even though the blockade is over and the normal supply chains are restored. Because she learned something from growing food in a space the size of a desk, and once you learn something like that, you do not want to unlearn it. That is us. That is the thing Vale was trying to describe on the docking bay. We do not just survive our difficulties and return to what we were before. We come back different. We bring something from the hard period into the easier one, and it changes us. And the change is usually, when you look at it over a long enough timeline, a kind of growth that would not have happened any other way. 312 outposts are still operating past the old boundary line. 400 or more, probably. The Thessaly Agreement gives them protected status and formal Accord recognition, which means they are no longer working around the system, but inside it, and the system is larger now because of where they already were. The expansion cap is gone. What replaced it is a set of mutual commitments about resource sharing and environmental standards and communication protocols that everyone agreed to and everyone had a hand in writing. It is not a perfect document. It will need revision. There will be disagreements ahead, real ones, because that is the nature of any relationship between parties who are genuinely different from each other and have genuinely different needs. Vale knows this. Ian knows this. I know this. The difference between the Thessaly framework and the mandate is that the Thessaly framework was built by people who understand that disagreement is not failure. It is information. It is how you learn, where the model needs updating. I think about my grandmother, whom I never met but know through the stories my father told me. The woman who grew food on a desk-sized patch of earth and repaired electrical equipment with mismatched parts and built a network out of neighbors who helped each other. Because that was what the situation required, and she was someone who responded to what situations required. She never knew that her great-grandson would one day sit in a room with 700 aliens and talk about her. But everything she did shaped the person who was in that room. The way you learn to solve problems when there are no easy solutions becomes the way you solve all problems, and the generation that learns it teaches the next one. And by the time you are 3 or 4 generations from the original difficulty, the skill is so deep in how your people think that you are not even aware of carrying it. The council looked at us and saw a history of difficulty. They did not see that the history of difficulty was also a history of solving difficulty, and that the solving had made us something they had no category for. A species that did not break the way managed species broke. A species that, when you tried to cut off what it needed, made what it needed somewhere else. A species that built redundancy into everything because it had learned, repeatedly, across centuries, that the thing you depend on can disappear, and what matters is what you do on the morning after it does. We are not ungovernable. I want to be careful about that. The Thessaly Agreement is governance. We work within it and we will continue to work within it because it is built on actual understanding rather than assumed understanding, and that difference matters. The mandate failed not because we cannot accept governance, but because the mandate was not built on us. It was built on a model of us that was missing most of what mattered. When you want to govern something, you have to understand it first, not approximately, not based on the visible surface of its history. Actually, genuinely, at the level of why it does what it does, and what happens when you push against it, and what it builds when you are not watching. The council was not watching when we built the supply chains. They were not watching when we built the outposts. They were not watching when a leaner put seedlings in a container on a windowsill. They were watching the formal, visible, trackable things, and they thought that the formal, visible, trackable things were the full picture. They were not. The full picture is 400 outposts and a protein bar and 14 hours of sleep, and a garden in Kyoto that 3 generations of my family have grown things in because the earth here is good, and the work is worth doing, and nobody needed to give them permission. A pale kin maintenance worker asked me once if the thing I was thinking about was bad. I told her I genuinely did not know. Ask me in a year, I said. It has been more than a year now. I know the answer. It was not bad. It was the most important year of my life and possibly, depending on how the Thessaly framework develops, one of the more important years in the history of what humanity and the Accord can become to each other. But I am careful about saying that too confidently, because confidence about the future is the thing that gets you into trouble, as the Council discovered. You make your model too certain. You stop asking whether the thing you are observing still matches the model. You stop looking at the ash and asking what was built from it. The cherry petals are still falling. They do not know they are beautiful. They do not know they are temporary. They fall because that is what they do when the time comes, and the time always comes. And after them the branch is bare for a while, and then the leaves come in and the tree keeps going. I could sit here all morning. I think I will. Somewhere past the veil, 400 outposts are working the problem in front of them. Nobody gave them orders. Nobody drew a chart. They looked at what needed doing and they started doing it, because that is what we are, underneath everything else, underneath the diplomacy and the reports and the emergency sessions and the 11 days of protein bars and too little sleep. We are the species that works the problem. We always have been. And we are not done yet, not even close.